So we received some questions about how to tap into the equity you already have in a home. So this is for people who already own a home and want to start scaling. Now for brand new beginners, this might be a confusing question. So let's explain.
So equity in a home is how much you actually own. So for example, if the home is currently worth $300,000 and you owe the bank $200,000 on your mortgage, then your equity is that difference, which is $100,000. So when you sell the property, you get to pocket the $100,000 minus all the closing costs, of course, and use that money for whatever you want. But some people don't want to sell their property and they want to be able to tap into that extra $100,000 that they have just sitting in the house. So there's two main ways to do it. One is with a HELOC, which is a home equity line of credit, and the other one is through a cash out refinance. I'm going to briefly go over each one before we go into our thoughts. So the first one is a HELOC, which is a home equity line of credit. This is where a bank will come in at a second position and give you a revolving line of credit that you can use like any other checking account. So from this account, you can write checks to yourself and you can use that money for almost whatever you want. So a second lien position is where you keep your original mortgage and they just give you a loan on top of what you already owe. This loan will not touch your original mortgage and it's typically going to be a higher interest rate than the loan that you have in first position because it is a riskier loan. And with a HELOC, these are going to be variable rate mortgages. So the interest rate on this changes all the time and it's typically a 5 to 10 year loan that's active. So you can use this line of credit for 5 to 10 years before you have to close it and open it again. Now the beauty of a home equity line of credit is that you don't have to pay interest on the money until you actually pull it out. So if you get a home equity line of credit for $50,000, then you don't actually have to pay interest on that $50,000 until you start pulling it out and start using it. And you can determine how much you want because it's just like a regular bank account. You can pull out $10,000, you can pull out $20,000, you can pay it back and stop paying interest on the money. It's great. It's like a revolving credit line. So whatever you use, you pay interest on. Now the amount that you can pull out for a HELOC really depends on the appraised value of the property. So let's say you bought a property a long time ago and the property has appreciated over time. You need to talk to a bank to get a HELOC approved and they're going to hire an appraiser to determine the current value. From there, your home equity line of credit will be limited based on a total percentage of your current mortgage plus the new HELOC that's going to be open. And it's typically going to be an 80% combined LTV. So if your property is worth $400,000, then your combined LTV can only be up to $320,000, which means your total mortgage between your first mortgage and the HELOC can only be $320,000. So if your mortgage today is $200,000, then your HELOC can only be up to $120,000. So these leverage numbers depend on the bank and they also depend on different market conditions. So you need to talk to a lender to find out these actual details.
So cash out refinance is where you get a larger loan than what you currently owe. That pays off the original loan and then you get to pocket the difference. And the difference you pocket is actually tax-free because it's a loan. So you get all that money when you close and you have to pay interest on the entire balance. So with the HELOC, you would only pay interest on whatever you pull out. Whereas with the cash out refinance, you would pay interest on that entire balance. Things are more flexible with the HELOC, whereas with the cash out refinance, it's pretty straightforward.
Cash out refinances are like any other mortgage. They can either have a fixed or a variable interest rate. They also come in 15-year or 30-year flavors.
So as an example, we had purchased this $120,000 moldy house. And we renovated it with about $80,000. And then we did a cash out refinance and it was appraised at $330,000. We were able to pull out 75% of the new appraised value. So of $330,000, we were able to pull out $247,500. Since we had paid all cash for the property, we didn't have to pay off an original existing loan before. So we were able to pocket all of that money minus the closing costs. So we were able to get a lot back that paid for all the money we had put into the deal and then some, and we were able to keep a cash flowing rental property. So this is actually called the BRRRR strategy, where you buy a property, you renovate it, you rent it out, you refinance, then you repeat this whole process. So this is a great way to scale your rental portfolio, but that's if you do the BRRRR strategy. Whereas if you are doing it for your primary home, you can't just keep doing that over and over again.
So now that you know what a HELOC and a cash out refinance is, the question is it worth it to do these things to then tap into your equity to buy more real estate? Now, this is a big it depends, because it depends on your situation and your current finances. And it also depends on your risk tolerance.
Now, one thing to consider is your interest rate. Like, what if you already had a really good interest rate on your primary home? Do you want to do a cash out refinance where you replace that existing loan with something possibly higher? You have to basically weigh if that makes sense for you or not. Because if the interest rate is a lot higher, it could end up being way more in monthly payments.
And are you willing to risk that? If this is your personal home and your mortgage payments are now higher, if the investment that you made with the money you pull out doesn't go through, then you're out that equity and now you're making higher interest payments on your mortgage.
So I think the way it would make sense is if you are pulling out money where it can actually make you more money in the future, then it could potentially make sense. Now, another problem though is if you keep doing that, you could potentially over leverage. And that means you are just getting more and more debt debt where you don't have that peace of mind. If something happens, you might not be able to cover yourself and you could go bankrupt possibly, right?
And lose your home. So you have to be very careful when you pull out equity from your primary residence. Another thing to note is when you do a cash out refinance or if you get a HELOC, your debt to income ratio can be impacted when getting your next loan for another rental property. So some people think, oh, I don't have enough income from my job to qualify for a loan. Let me get a HELOC or a cash out refinance, get more money, and then use that to down payment to then buy another rental. That actually won't work because when a bank underwrites you, they're going to look at your loan for your current property. They're going to look at any HELOCs you have and assume that you're pulling out the maximum amount and using that as part of the debt payment. It's going to be actually harder to qualify for another rental property.
We did cover what DTI meant earlier, but it basically means your total monthly debt divided by your total monthly income. So if you continuously get more debt, then you would have to make sure your income continuously increases so that you're able to get more loans. It's also risky if you're just depending on this cash out refi or HELOC completely, right? You want to make sure you have 6 months of emergency funds. You never know what's going to happen. So you want to tally up your monthly expenses, make sure you're covered.
Another thing to consider is that this strategy of doing a cash out refinance or a HELOC on your existing properties isn't super scalable unless, again, we're going through the BRRRR strategy and you are buying with the intent of refinancing. But if you're just trying to pull equity on properties you already own, there's only so much you can pull out before you can't do it anymore. So we actually do recommend really focusing your energies on trying to build more income versus trying to tap into the existing equity of properties that you already own. Now, when it comes down to it, I think HELOCs are a better option if you have the ability to, although I know that many lenders will not do a HELOC for rental properties simply because the flexibility of having HELOC is very strong and it can act as an emergency funds, right? You can have that account open and you can use that account if things are going poorly.
So ultimately, make sure you're considering the risks that we talked about earlier. Don't over leverage. Make sure that you're putting in a plan in place where you are able to invest that money even further to possibly make that money work for you. But we do believe that it is better to put more of your energy into increasing your income.
And if you are trying to tap into your equity, make sure you double, triple, quadruple check that your plan is solid because there is no going back. If you had a low interest rate loan and you do a cash out refinance to a higher rate, your low interest rate loan is gone and you're going to be paying a higher mortgage on a higher balance. So just be very careful.